stop till they hear me now. I won't stop till I wear the crown. I swear to God they all let me down. I always fought just to win the crown. I off with these fucking crowds. We're on top, they deserve it now. It's only worth it if you work for it. It's only worth it if you work for it. I won't stop till they hear me now. I won't stop till I... Let's go. I'm just telling you to fight for your dreams, but it's not what it seems. Man, it's hard to be seen when everybody wants to be king. Yeah, they all wanna ring. Yeah, we all wanna be free. So show me what you got, what you bring, how you fight in the ring, how you take a fucking swing.
Welcome, friends. In this final build episode for the Jeep, I'm repairing damage to the body, installing a few extras for the Jeep, and getting carried away with many projects. The most noticeable issue when I first saw the Jeep was the front end damage. It seemed like I might need to just replace the plastic headlight shroud and pop out the bumper cover, but in order to figure it out, I needed to actually pull the front end apart. I removed the plastic front bumper cover and grille, which is held in by 3 palm rivets and a 10mm bolt in the wheel wells on either side, as well as 3 plastic push rivets under the lower radiator support. The grille has 3 bolts on the face and 3 on top, which secure it to the headlight support panel. After removing everything, the bumper can be slid off the fender clips by pulling it forward. The damage to the front impact bar was much worse than I expected, since the whole corner had been knocked in and the headlight shroud was broken. Next, I ended up removing the headlights and the headlight shroud using a 7mm socket and T25 Torx bit. The headlight wiring harness can be removed at the headlight or from the clips underneath the shroud and on top of the frame rails. Underneath the shroud was an even more mangled mess, since the passenger side retains the fan relay and the vacuum box for the engine. I briefly tried bending it back by hand, but wanted to get the new headlight shroud installed since I didn't think that I needed to actually fix the impact bar, just bend it back enough to support the headlight. It was very difficult to find a headlight shroud at the junkyard since the majority of them had broken tabs on the top or bottom. You can buy a new one online, but they're around $200 shipped. I did end up finding one that wasn't broken on a Jeep WJ Special Edition, and I took off the front bumper and the headlight shroud off of it. Once I set the new shroud in the Jeep, I was able to reference how far to pull out the impact bar. I probably could have taken this to a body shop with a frame machine and they could have just pulled it right out, but I thought it would be easier and cheaper to just fix it myself. After prying out as much as I could, I unbolted the fender from the front impact support and drilled out the pinch welds to allow me to manipulate the pieces individually. I was able to get the vertical support and horizontal support pretty straight, but the impact bar itself was too twisted. The spot welds were easy enough to drill out, so I had the bright idea of grabbing one at the junkyard and swapping it out. That way I could guarantee that the impact bar would be in the right location and properly support the headlight. This turned out to be way more work than I thought, since there are a ridiculous amount of welds on this thing, and I went through 2 sets of Cobalt step drill bits from Harbor Freight. The biggest thing that I learned here was that I should have worn gloves and a long sleeve cotton shirt, since the metal shavings put burn marks all over my hands and arms. I hadn't purchased a welder yet at this point, and my plan was to use panel adhesive and rivets to install the new impact bar. It took a surprisingly long time to find, order, and receive the proper gun for the adhesive, so I ended up moving on to menial tasks. While looking around for WJ upgrades, I found out that the WJ doesn't come with a cabin air filter from the factory. This is a problem for several reasons, but primarily because that means that all kinds of junk can get into the HVAC system and destroy the fan. I bought the OEM kit online and went to install. The filter is installed underneath the windshield cowl, which is removed using a Torx bit to pull out those cool long plastic nuts, and a 15mm socket to remove the wiper nuts. I did not need a puller for the wipers and was just able to wiggle them off. Then I could pull off the weather stripping and then lift the cowl. The Jeep had been sitting under a tree for 5 years, so there was a bunch of debris under the cowl that I vacuumed up. It might be worth cleaning this area every now and then anyway, otherwise you might get ants. Once I pulled off the old baffle and cleaned out as much as I could, I installed the filter bracket, which has a foam seal and is held in by a couple of tough push rivets in the center. There's also some clips on either side, so be careful not to break those. The filter slides right inside of the bracket, and then the cover over top of that. I think I'm still happy with this, but I need to check on it again since there's no protection from above. It seems that the filter will just get soaked every time it rains. It's not the best design in my opinion. I bought trim paint for the door and mirror trim, but I figured that I could use it on the cowl also since I had it out. So I painted the cowl using black Duplicolor trim and bumper paint and hit the wipers with some black chassis paint. I had found some recovery hooks at the junkyard and wanted to get those painted up at the same time. I painted the brackets with black chassis paint before reinstalling the cowl and later painting the recovery hooks red using VHT wrinkle paint. At this point, I had purchased the welder and it was time to start working on finishing the front end. I needed access to the sheet metal behind the fender, so I pulled off the front passenger fender by supporting the hood and using a 10mm socket to remove or loosen the top bolts and the bolts in the wheel well. It is possible to remove the fender without taking off the hood bracket since the bolts are both Torx and 10mm. And there's a window to loosen the bolt, but mine was seized on and it snapped the Torx bit in two. Once I got the fender off physically, I couldn't remove the antenna because the nut was corroded onto the sleeve. I pushed it anyway and the nut ended up snapping off. Looking at it later, it might be a dissimilar metal thing because it literally looked like one piece, like the nut was physically connected to the sleeve. Now that I had the space, I had a great idea to use a jack to bend the metal back into position. I spent hours trying to get it perfect before acknowledging that I just suck at bodywork and it will never be perfect. After I got it as close as I could, I sanded back the paint, clamped it together, and started welding. I had to weld the supports to the upper impact bar first since I couldn't clamp it properly with the impact bar attached, the front portion. Then I sprayed everything down with weld-through primer and waited a day to start welding on the front portion of the impact bar. The front impact bar was one of the first things that I welded. I practiced on 20 gauge sheet metal from Home Depot, but I still did a pretty bad job. I was basically trying to fill in a hole with flux core weld on two pieces of steel that were super thin and not the same thickness in all areas. I'd get a really good weld in one spot and then burn straight through on the next spot. With no real welding experience, I'm probably just lucky I didn't burn the whole thing down. But it worked out, I got it put on there, and it is solid. After finishing up the last weld, I used a flap disc to flatten everything down and then hit it with primer, self-etching primer, and black chassis paint. Before installing the fender for the last time, I used my favorite baby vice grips to fix a kink and straighten out the corner near the headlight. Then I moved on to installing the front recovery hooks using the special hardware that I pulled off the donor Jeep that the hooks were on. When I originally pulled the special edition bumper off a Jeep at the junkyard, it was because it looked great and it had more modern round fog light holes compared to the older style rectangular ones. I had seen some YouTube videos of people installing fog lights on the WJs and it seemed like a very simple process since they're all supposed to be pre-wired for fog lights. But this Jeep was not. The previous owner had installed automatic headlight and fog light stock on the steering column, and I had already installed a used fog light relay. I didn't want to install an aftermarket switch for the fog lights, so I went back to the junkyard, found a pre-wired Jeep that hadn't been crushed yet, and I tore apart the wiring harness to get the wiring. It was just a small black wire running to a local ground, and then there was a long blue wire on either side running to the main driver and passenger side harness connectors. I wasn't sure if this was going to work since there were no fog light wires going to the bumper. That meant that there might not be wiring going to the switch, right? But I pulled out the wires from the junkyard WJ, I bought fog lights on Amazon, and I gave it a shot. After getting a good ground, it did light right up. Now that I knew it would work, I began installing the wiring from front to back, making sure that I had enough slack to reach the fog lights. The entry on the passenger side was the most difficult to get to, since I had to unbolt the coolant reservoir and ECU from the firewall. Then I made a small cut in the grommet and passed the wire through. The stock harness has a local ground that's spliced into the harness just behind the headlights, so I had to add additional wire there in order to reach the ground bolt. After verifying that the switch still worked, I went ahead and installed the driver's side fog light wiring. I wanted to get the rest of the front end back together, and I started reinstalling everything that I took apart during the repair, including reinstalling the fan relay, the cruise control vacuum solenoid, and the new vacuum box that I got at the junkyard. Then I installed the headlight shroud and the new horns that I got at the junkyard since my old ones were smashed. During some of my early downtime, I went ahead and started installing LED lights everywhere, including the headlights. This is a huge pain because the low power on the blinkers and the parking lights required resistors, and I couldn't find a good set of LED headlights that weren't hundreds of dollars. An easy fix for all of this is aftermarket headlight housings, but I didn't want Mama riding around in a riced out Jeep, so I made the LED headlights fit with some epoxy and a lot of grinding on the mount and the heat sink. I don't recommend this at all. I got too far into it and spent way too much time on it. It's not worth it. Here is a 50-50 split with the new lights on the passenger side and the old lights on the driver's side. I had some difficulty reinstalling the headlight housings because the parking light resistors were getting caught and pulling out the light. It just took some extra work to make them fit properly. The hood was also still dented a little bit, so I bent it back and made a few adjustments to the hood rests before moving on to the bumpers. My original plan had been to paint the bumpers with the same black trim paint as the windshield cowl, but now I was planning on using truck bed liner. Before painting, however, I wanted to install some parking sensors in the rear bumper. I thought that this would help with backing up since I hadn't purchased the reverse camera or the aftermarket head unit yet. Mopar actually makes a kit, but it's like $400, and you can find all kinds of kits on Amazon for between $30 and $120 with no difference in rating. So I ended up choosing the best rated one that I could find, and I followed the Mopar instructions for installation. After test fitting the sensors, I scuffed up the bumpers, filled in any serious damage, cleaned them, and started painting. Like most of the other painting that I did during the series, I didn't film all of it, but I put on about 3 coats, and then I moved on to polishing the silver portion of the front bumper. I decided to keep that silver and then reinstall it. I I'd been driving the vehicle for about a week, and I kept getting codes for the fan relay. The relay was underneath everything I had just put in, and I thought maybe I just hadn't connected it all the way, but instead of being cheap, I decided to buy a new relay and fuse and swap them out before installing the front bumper. After swapping the relay and fuse, I polished the headlights and installed the front bumper. I was pretty much done when I realized that I forgot to install the lower support bracket. This is a thin piece of sheet metal that bolts into the lower radiator support and supports the bumper from underneath. Once the bumper was officially installed, I threw in the fog lights, connected the wiring, and tested them out. The headlight shroud and front bumper were from the same special edition WJ, and it's a completely different design from the one-piece bumper grille combo that's listed or depicted in the parts catalogs from 2001 to 2004. I cannot even find this part number when searching online. So maybe this is just a subcomponent for the bumper or for the headlight shroud, I don't know. In either case, I was able to find a brand new aftermarket black one for sale. I bought some Duplicolor plastic adhesion promoter and matching paint, and then got the new grille painted and installed. Moving on to the rear bumper, I installed the parking sensors by pushing the wiring through the hole, and the sensors have a rubber material around their circumference which secure them into place. Then I ran the wiring to the passenger side and zip tied them up. Installing the bumper was a giant mess because the sensors require a lot of the foam to be cut out of the bumper support. I spent about an hour taking the bumper on and off, cutting more and more until it finally fit. Then I ran the wiring into the cabin through the passenger taillight before installing new LED blinkers, parking lights, and reverse lights. Wiring the aftermarket parking sensors is exactly the same as wiring the Mopar sensors. You connect all the sensors to the control box, connect the speaker, and splice into the reverse lights on the passenger side for power, using a local ground. The Mopar kit mounts the speaker in the D-pillar, but I ran the aftermarket one under the dash. I haven't wanted to tear the Jeep apart again while visiting my mom, but this kit is definitely not good. It beeps constantly and gets rapid while close to an object, but the speaker is underpowered and the pitch changes wildly. This might be fixed if I shorten the wire and mounted the speaker in the rear like the Mopar one, but I'm not sure. I don't really know what to do with this. I went back and forth on this, but I decided to remove the door trim and side skirts to paint them with truck bed liner. The trim in the wheel wells is held in with cross-tip screws and double-sided tape. The side skirts are held on by cross-tip screws and these cool rectangular trim clips. I don't know why, but I find those very satisfying. The door trim is held in by molded clips and double-sided tape. I had to use a trim tool, press down at the top of the molded clips and pull outward to remove them. Then I used some heat to pull them all the way off. I didn't record it, but I did have to spend a couple of hours listening to an audiobook while completely removing the old double-sided tape from the doors. It just took forever. I ordered some amber LED fog lights to replace the stock halogens, but they didn't fit, so I ordered a second set, which also didn't fit, but they were close enough that I could modify the clips, or the tabs, and fit them in there. Of course, then I found out that the bulbs were not amber as marked, they were definitely white, but I wasn't going to waste any more time and money, so I kept them in and reinstalled the front wheel well liners. It was finally time to do some repairs on the rear hatch. While installing the LED license plate lights in the rear hatch, I noticed that the hatch was dented, and what I thought was just paint damage was actually a crack in the tailgate. I figured that I'd remove the trim from the outside and inside, pop out the dent, fill the crack, and blend in some new paint. It took me a while to realize that the crack was Bondo, and that the panel had already been poorly repaired. There were a few dozen holes through the panel, from when someone used a stud welder to pull out a large dent and then slathered on at least 1/8 of an inch of Bondo. When they reinstalled the window gasket upside down, water leaked in and rusted the panel from the inside, causing the Bondo and paint to crack. I stood around for a little while and then decided to sand it all off, re-Bondo, and repaint. After about 30 minutes, I realized that was a stupid idea because every hole had rust in it and I'd have to fill all the holes with weld and then sand it, paint the interior and exterior before filling with Bondo and repainting it. It would take me weeks to figure that out. I'm not a body, I don't know how to do any of this. So I went to my happy place and got the least dented door that I could find. I took the hatch home in the cab of the Raptor and had my battle buddy help me disassemble and prep the hatch for paint. I sanded down both sides of the hatch and I cleaned the surface with acetone before painting the interior with 3 coats of Duplicolor paint match and 1K gloss. The exterior of the hatch had a few more dents than I thought after cleaning the surface, so I tried pulling them out using a kit from Harbor Freight. I have been successful with these glue type kits on other cars, but this kit did almost nothing. After giving it a shot, I put some Bondo in rough areas and then I cleaned the surface again and painted it. After the second coat of clear, I realized that painting a large surface is very challenging. I had to put the clear on so thick that it started running and I was getting tons of hair and dust in the paint. Now I am painting a whole panel inside of a garage with the door open, so I suppose I should expect this. But I didn't run into any issues with the grill, so I thought that this would just be a cakewalk. I ended up wet sanding the panel and then putting on another 4 coats of clear to make it thick enough. The paint actually dried really fast, but I gave it an extra day before reinstalling the exterior trim and latches. The hatch swap only took a couple of hours, including wiring the reverse camera. The first thing I did was pull off the glass and struts using various Torx bits, being careful not to lose the plastic washers that come with the struts. The most difficult part of this whole thing was removing the washer nozzle from the old hatch. I broke the nozzle while removing it on the new hatch and I didn't want to repeat, so I was very careful to release the clips on the left and right of the nozzle before pulling it out and disconnecting the hose. Then I lifted the hatch, disconnected the wiring, supported the panel with a jack bar, and then unbolted the hatch from the Jeep. Once the old hatch was off, I was able to install the new one in reverse order, trying to match the hinges up with the old locations. Once the glass was back on, I fished the video, power, and relay wiring through the wiring hose and wired up the reverse camera. I spliced the relay wire into the driver's side reverse light wiring before reinstalling the last of the trim, gaskets, and window rests. While driving the Jeep, I noticed that I had to hop a bit to get inside. I figured it would be hard for my mom to get in and out without running boards, and I found a cheap set on Amazon that I thought would work great since they're also frame mounted and might be able to double as a lightweight slider. It took me about 7 hours to do the driver's side off camera because I ran into an insane amount of issues trying to install the rivet nuts because they were popping out, stripping, or not able to clamp onto the 2 or 3 pieces of overlapping sheet metal in some areas. I did a bad job reinforcing the rivet nut support with welds, but I was determined to do a better job on the passenger side. On the passenger side, the plan was to use only 2 rivet nuts per support for proper positioning and then to weld the mounts on. I supported the running board, marked the spots that needed to be trimmed on the forward mount, cut those spots with an angle grinder, and then set everything back in place to mark the spots for drilling. Once I drilled out the holes, I tried doing the riv nuts again, but it didn't work out. I found that the best way to do this was the same way that South Main Repair did his Iron Rock off-road slider install. He pulled a bolt through the inside and tacked it on, and then used nuts to secure the running boards. After I tacked on the studs, I marked the pinch weld hole locations and drilled them out. Then I did the final install and just welded on the running boards. I'll still put these running boards in the description, but I'm not really sure that there's a purpose for these things. They aren't actually wide enough to use as a step or to protect your door, and they aren't strong enough to use as sliders. But they may be a good start to sliders if you box in the supports completely. I don't know if you know this, but I own a welder, so I'm pretty much a master fabricator. At least that's what I was thinking when I decided to spend a whole day making hood vents. After reading about overheating issues with the 4.0, I wanted to install functional hood vents, but I couldn't find an off-the-shelf solution which would allow me to put the vents in an area beneficial for venting heat without compromising the electrical system. So I decided to try and make a water diversion box and cut gaps on the sides to allow heat to escape up and out. I found open areas under the hood which would clear the intake and valve cover, and I bought plastic vents which would be the right size. Then I made a cardboard design which would allow the water to drain toward the rear of the vehicle and clear any electrical wiring. The driver's side had the least clearance, so I tested that side first by drilling corner holes and cutting out the sheet metal. Then I installed the diversion tray with rivets and test fit the hood. The driver's side fit great, so I did the same thing on the passenger side, making the tray, cutting the hood, riveting it in, and I also actually had to fix some mistakes that I made during the process. I used 120 grit sandpaper on a random orbital polisher to get the surface of the hood prepped for paint, but I was way too aggressive and I should have done at most, I think, probably 600 grit. Because then I had to use Bondo to make repairs, and I was still left with swirls on the surface after putting down the base in the clear. But I was in a rush because around this time my mom had called because her old car was having starting issues and leaking lots of oil. I had to finally set a hard date to deliver the Jeep the following weekend, so I worked fast and I barely recorded anything. There was a pretty big dent in the driver rear quarter panel, and it's in an awkward location near the gas fill cap, so I didn't want to tack weld it, but I was able to use some 3/8 inch extensions and a small sledgehammer to knock it out from the inside. When it was close, I threw some Bondo on there. I had to have gone through like 8 iterations of Bondo before I lost my patience and decided to just paint it. Now that the Jeep was out of the garage and the running boards were already installed, I was able to cut the side skirts to fit and then paint all the trim with truck bed liner to match the front and rear bumpers. I also did some touch-ups on the bumpers at the same time. After all the trim dried, I added new 3M double-sided tape, and the Jeep was pretty much done. The night before I left, I leveled the headlights, and then I loaded up the Raptor and made my 8-hour journey to deliver the Jeep to my mother in Florida. I added the last of the badging while I was down there using Jeep badges from a 2005 Grand Cherokee and 4x4 badging off of Amazon. Alright, so the expenses this episode are surprisingly high, and I say surprisingly because most of the items I installed during this episode were already paid for in episode 1, including the bumpers. So the body panel expense covered the new grille, the impact bar, the rear hatch, and the running boards. The trim expense covers mud flaps, hood vents, and emblems. The hitch expense just covered the rear hitch recovery D-ring and the hitch lock. The lighting expense covered all of the LED bulbs and fog light wiring. Electronics was parking sensors, a new antenna mount, and the used horns. Paint included the Herculiner bed liner, trim paint, the Duplicolor base and clear coats, and the Bondo. So the total cost for this episode was $1,246 for a final project cost of $11,884. First takeaway is that not everything should be a DIY. If I could do this again, I would have waited until all the mechanical stuff was done and taken the Jeep to a body shop with a frame machine to just pull out the front right corner instead of having to drill and weld in the new front impact bar. I would still do the rear hatch and corner panel myself because it would just be way too expensive to have someone else do those professionally. But my second takeaway is that a rattle can paint job is paint that only a mother can love. My mother did tell me that she thinks this looks awesome, but I'm not proud of it. I'm not proud of how the paint came out. I know that with any fiberglass or Bondo or paint job, it's all about how much work you put in, and if you don't do it right, you'll end up with something that you're not happy with. My third takeaway is in reference to the Mopar cabin air filter. It's just a bad design. And I'm glad that I didn't spend the money for Mopar parking sensors because I'm sure that they wouldn't work great either. Finally, now that I have a welder, I try to find every excuse to use it and get experience on it. That shouldn't mean that I should tack on extra projects like the hood vents when they're just not necessary. The diversion trays made some flat spots in the hood, and when installing the vent covers a day after painting, it peeled up to clear coat. I mean, the hood vents definitely work, but at what cost? Also, if I could redo the running boards, I just drill and tack on the studs for every mounting hole instead of permanently welding on the running boards. So that's it for the build. If I do another episode, it'll be a follow-up when I visit Mama on Turkey Day. So maybe we can get the Jeep out somewhere and go off-road. Anywho, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.